One man's obsession with revenge turned the world into a battlefield. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, no one imagined that within just 6 years, he would drag the entire planet into the deadliest war in human history. This is the story of how one man, driven by hatred, ambition, and a twisted vision, ignited World War II. The First World War ended in 1918, leaving Germany humiliated, broken, and bankrupt. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was a dagger to the heart of the German people. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, pay crushing reparations, lose 13% of its territory, and shrink its army to a fraction of what it once was. Factories closed, inflation exploded, families starved, and in this chaos, a former corporal of the German army, Adolf Hitler, found his purpose. He promised revenge. He promised to restore Germany's pride. He promised to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, and the people desperate for hope listened. In 1919, Hitler joined a small, unknown group called the German Workers' Party, later renamed the National Socialist, German Workers' Party or Nazi Party. With fiery speeches and hypnotic charisma, Hitler transformed politics into theater. He blamed Jews, communists, and Western powers for Germany's downfall. He painted himself as the savior of the nation. By 1933, through propaganda, fear, and manipulation, Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he dismantled democracy, silenced opposition, and declared himself Führer, the supreme leader. Now, with absolute power, he turned his eyes toward vengeance. The Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from building tanks, aircraft, or a large army. But Hitler didn't care. In secret, he rebuilt Germany's military, training pilots in the Soviet Union, constructing weapons under civilian names, and preparing for war. In 1935, he announced it openly. Germany would rearm. The world protested, but no one stopped him. Britain and France, still scarred by the First World War, were unwilling to fight again. Hitler took it as a sign of weakness. He was right. The Rhineland was a demilitarized zone on Germany's western border. According to the Versailles Treaty, no German soldier was allowed there. But in March 1936, Hitler took a gamble. He ordered his troops to march into the Rhineland, knowing that if France resisted, he'd have to retreat. France did nothing. Britain stayed silent. Hitler celebrated. If the French had marched in, we would have had to withdraw. But they did not. My generals are now mine. The world saw him as bold. He saw the world as weak. His confidence grew dangerously. Next, Hitler turned his attention to Austria, his birthplace. He demanded a union, called the Anschluss, between Germany and Austria, claiming both were one people. When Austria's chancellor resisted, Hitler ordered troops to the border. Terrified, the Austrian government surrendered. On March 12, 1938, German soldiers rolled into Vienna, greeted by cheering crowds and swastika flags. Again, Britain and France did nothing. Hitler had just conquered a country without firing a single bullet. After Austria, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia. He claimed Germans there were being mistreated and that he needed to protect them. It was a lie, but a powerful one. Europe trembled. War seemed imminent. Then came the Munich Conference in September 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, met Hitler. Hitler swore that if he got Sudetenland, he'd make no further demands. Chamberlain believed him. France agreed. Czechoslovakia was not even invited. The Munich Agreement handed Hitler the Sudetenland, and peace, they thought, was saved. When Chamberlain returned to London, he waved the paper and declared, "Peace for our time." But Hitler was already planning his next move. Only 6 months after Munich, Hitler tore up the agreement. In March 1939, German troops invaded what remained of Czechoslovakia. It was the first time he seized a non-German territory. Europe finally realized Hitler could not be trusted. Britain and France issued a warning. Any further aggression would mean war. But Hitler had already chosen his next target, Poland. Poland stood between Germany and the Soviet Union. Hitler wanted its land for Lebensraum, living space for the German people. But invading Poland risked war with Britain and France. So Hitler made a shocking deal with his greatest ideological enemy. In August 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty. Secretly, they agreed to divide Poland between them. Now Hitler could strike without fear of Soviet resistance. At dawn on September 1, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border. Planes bombed Warsaw. Tanks rolled through the countryside. But Hitler needed a reason, an excuse to justify the invasion. So the Nazis staged a fake Polish attack on a German radio station, the Gleiwitz incident. Dead bodies in Polish uniforms were left as proof. In truth, they were German prisoners murdered by the SS. Hours later, Hitler went on the radio and declared, "Since 5:45 a.m. we are shooting back." It was a lie, but the war had begun. On September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had officially begun, but by then it was too late for Poland. Within weeks, the German Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, crushed Polish defenses. From the east, the Soviet Union invaded, taking its share under the secret pact. By early October, Poland was gone, carved in two by the dictators of Europe. With Poland conquered, Hitler stood triumphant. But his ambitions went far beyond revenge. He dreamed of a new empire, a 1,000-year Reich stretching from France to Russia. He wanted to erase entire peoples, enslaved nations, and build a world ruled by Aryans. In his mind, the war wasn't just political, it was racial, and he believed destiny itself was on his side. Within a year, Hitler's armies conquered Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. By 1940, Nazi flags flew from the Atlantic to the Vistula River. The world was at his feet. But he had started a fire that could not be contained. Britain fought on. The Soviet Union would soon become his greatest enemy. And the United States, though distant, would not stay silent forever. The war that began with one man's obsession would become humanity's greatest nightmare. Hitler's dream of domination soon turned into disaster. He underestimated his enemies and overestimated himself. The invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the entry of America into the war all turned the tide. What began as Hitler's victory march became his downfall. By 1945, Berlin was in ruins. The Reich he promised would last 1,000 years collapsed in just 12. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, the man who started World War II, ended his own life in a bunker beneath the city he destroyed. By 1940, Hitler stood at the height of his power. Europe trembled under his boots. France had fallen. Britain was isolated, but still, he was not satisfied. Hitler believed he was unstoppable, that destiny itself protected him. So he made a decision that would seal his fate, to invade the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border, backed by 3,000 tanks and 2,000 aircraft. At first, it was a storm of victory. Soviet cities fell one after another: Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. The world watched in horror as Hitler's armies reached the gates of Moscow. But then came winter. German soldiers froze in the snow wearing summer uniforms. Engines wouldn't start, supplies failed, and for the first time the myth of Nazi invincibility shattered. Hitler refused to retreat. He shouted at his generals, "Not one step back. We will hold our ground." But the Soviet counterattack pushed the Germans back. Thousands died, not from bullets, but from cold and starvation. The war that Hitler thought would last months turned into a nightmare that would consume him. While Hitler bled in the east, a new storm gathered in the west. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war, and Hitler, in a moment of arrogance, declared war on America too. Now he faced the combined power of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, the three greatest nations on Earth. The Allies began to strike back. In North Africa, German forces under Rommel were defeated. In 1943, at Stalingrad, Hitler's army was destroyed, over 300,000 men lost. It was the beginning of the end. All across Europe, the people Hitler had conquered began to rise. Resistance movements sabotaged railways, attacked Nazi troops, and sent intelligence to the Allies. From the air, Allied bombers turned German cities into firestorms. Factories, railroads, even Berlin. Nothing was safe. And still, Hitler refused to surrender. He screamed at his generals, executed officers who spoke truth, and lived inside a fantasy where Germany was still winning. But outside his bunker, the Third Reich was collapsing. By early 1945, the Red Army was closing in from the east, and Allied forces from the west. Berlin, once the pride of the Reich, was burning. Hitler hid inside his underground bunker deep beneath the Chancellery. He was pale, trembling, and paranoid. He spoke of betrayal, of cowardice, of destiny lost. Above him, bombs thundered day and night. The sound of Soviet artillery grew louder each hour. His dream of a 1,000-year empire had lasted barely 12. In his final days, he married Eva Braun, his longtime companion. They shared a last meal, said their goodbyes, and on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the head. Eva took poison beside him. Their bodies were burned in the courtyard, as ordered. 2 days later, Berlin fell. The war Hitler started, the war he believed would make him immortal, ended with his death in fire and ruin. World War II ended in 1945, but its scars never faded. Over 70 million lives were lost. Cities were erased. Families vanished. Nations divided. The Nuremberg trials exposed the horrors of Hitler's empire and the concentration camps, the mass executions, the unimaginable cruelty. The world looked into the abyss and vowed never again. But history whispers a warning. Tyranny does not begin with tanks or bombs. It begins with words, with fear, with silence. And the story of Adolf Hitler reminds us that when hatred is allowed to grow unchecked, it can set the entire world on fire.